It's that timeless pursuit of when art merges with the artist, where we put ourselves out there, find that moment of motivation, and ride the momentum, and then love the very art we create. These are all deeply linked to the soul of who we are. Some say you might be able to measure that, but perhaps it is a blind pursuit. Hello, everybody. Yes, welcome to 21 Grams. I am your host, Joe Compton, and look who I rustled up. The one and only Mr. Jim Nettles. Hello, sir.
Yeah, you dug me out of my crypt, and
you were digging into sand, and we pulled you out.
Well, I'm still waiting on achieving my final godlike form, but
aren't we all? Aren't we all? So for those of you, for the one person out there who may not know you, say hello and tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Jim Nettles. I write under a bunch of different names over the years, but I write science fiction, urban fantasy, horror, contemporary, plus a bunch of nonfiction stuff. I've done a bunch of business technology, all kinds of fun stuff in terms of being a writer. I am the founder of Author Essentials and Author Essentials workshops, where we teach business stuff for creatives. I am one of the founders over at Continual Convention, where of course we stir up trouble all the time. And I'm involved in a whole bunch of other sort of fun stuff that, gaming and all sorts of just fun stuff. If there's trouble to be caused.
Yeah. It usually
I'm sure I missed some stuff in there somewhere, but it's already been a day.
All right. Well, Anita's here. Hello.
And hey, Anita. Hey, Jennifer.
Yeah. We've had so many conversations over the years, and it usually evolves around, the technology aspect of things, because you're so versatile in that, and you're so knowledgeable in that. But I thought we'd have a little fun tonight, because I think for people who don't know, you participated in the anthology that's sitting in between us here, the Fairy Films, and it was basically a bunch of authors, creating fae around popular film franchises and products of the science fiction and fantasy era. And so you did a nice little essay on how Dune was actually a faedom, basically, and based on fae lore. So I thought we talk about lore a little bit tonight, and talk a little bit about that and the idea of it. Give everybody a little bit of just like a brief synopsis of what I'm talking about.
Well, so to give the very short version of this, so Josh Cutchin has been a friend of mine for a long time, and he had pinged me and said, "Hey, I'm working on this thing, but send me something different." Right? It's like, I've already got Labyrinth, I've got this, I got this. So I sent a list of proposals, and at the top of that list, because I'd gone down to the film cabinet, I was like, all right, what are some of the favorite films? But I knew that this was going to be the first on the list, just to see the look on his face was. Dune is fairy folklore. And I get back a text, and he goes, there's no way you're going to tell me Dune is fairy folklore. So I sent this is only supposed to be like a 6,000 word essay, right? So I sent a 1,000-word proposal. And he goes, okay, I just got to see the full. And at one point in time, this thing got up to, I don't know, about 15, 16,000 words. And then it got trimmed back down to, it's not the longest piece in here, but it was at one point before it got edited pretty heavy. Yeah. But part of that was hey, this is a bet. Let's have fun with it.
Yeah.
Part of it, though, was when you look at a lot of fantasy folklore and science fiction and all these things, it's what are the fundamental elements of story. Part of my misspent youth, I did some graduate level work in, mythology and cultural anthropology, all these sorts of weird things. So there's this weird repository of things in my head that at times will go and say, let's create connections. And, having played the game before about, how do you take this story and turn it into that?
Yeah.
And one of the nice parts when you're talking about this spectrum between hard science fiction over here and off the wall fantasy on this other end, you get this really interesting place in the middle where speculative fiction gives you so much more room to work with, tell a story, and to play with folklore.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, if we look at the stories, the books, the films, things like this that resonate and hold us the longest, it's not necessarily because somebody has come and created this grand new lore, because they've taken the things that are essential and told them to us in a new way to connect to them. And that to me really was one of the big things about Dune. And when I first got a hold of Dune when I think a birthday present when I was 10 years old. And I remember reading it and kind of being in that there was a lot of things I got, and there was a lot of things that I just like, okay, I might have to do this. I at least at that time knew enough to go and say, this is something I'm gonna have to come back to. And then I got to see the 84 version of Dune, right? The big David Lynch space sperms. But I mean, I went back and then reread the book, even though, just a few years older, but there was a lot of maturing you get to do when you're in those teenage years. And one of the things that has always held my attention about Dune, and I think is true as to why it's become such a fundamental part of folklore and story, is because it, looking at the period of time it came out. I mean, let's look at it, everything in that late 60s era, everything came out from, let's call it the mid 50s up into the early 70s. You get Lord of the Rings, you get the starting of the Dune saga, you start getting a lot of you just get this massive drop of science fiction and fantasy. This is when you're getting Ray Bradbury, this is when you're getting Asimov, you're getting all of who we consider to be the fundamental storytellers that we all still go back and are influenced by. And so when I look at Dune, it pulls in all those elements of story, and it pulls in so much of folklore from that aspect of where will we be as humanity in thousands of years down the road, and how will we view our myths and legends from today or even our past now when we look at things thousands of years down the road. That's really kind of the big take I took in looking at it. And the other thing for me with Dune is the entire saga. I mean, even when I did some stuff with Kevin J. Anderson, who's picked it up and continuing this now with Frank Son. But sitting down, part of the conversation was the thing for me that means Dune is really what it is because it makes us challenge why do we believe what we believe. And that is one of my biggest drivers is, for myself personally, why do we believe what we believe? What are the things that influence us? What are the things that drive us? What are the things that make us question who we are and why we're here?
And yet, I think it is I'm getting an echo, by the way.
Oh. I can take it off. Hang on a minute. I'll swap it over to. We'll do this. Sorry about that.
No worries.
And I could probably move the mic, but we'll just do this.
One of the things that I think is interesting too is like the way that classic literature tends to mirror what we're experiencing now in a lot of respects. And I think that it's interesting that you took the approach that you did and kind of went back in time with this essay per se. But I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, the Atreides is a really good example of power corrupts absolutely, right? And kind of and that aspect of it. When there was an idealistic young man who turned into a monster, basically, and that aspect of it. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, if you find that's what appeals to you about classical literature like that, or early science fiction fantasy, is that it does mirror a lot of what we're experiencing.
Well, if I go back and we look at, Greco-Roman myths and legends, the old gods, right? We see a lot of this in notions of the gods and powerful, and the interplay between what happens when mere mortals get sucked up and involved.
Yeah.
This notion of what happens if someone becomes a demigod or a god, this notion of power.
Mm.
Looking at the notion of how power is displayed through these books, and if you read and you listen to some of the interviews from Frank Herbert over time as he talked about, especially the first 3 books, it was meant to be that melody of, oh, we've got our great hero. But at the end of the day, you have to look at your hero. What are the things that sculpt and mold them, their belief systems and everything else? And if you really look at the lore of the Bene Gesserit, and if you look at this breeding program for thousands and thousands of years to get down to, ta-da, here's, because his mother, of course, kind of went off the rails and said, I want to make my husband happy, and I'm doing that instead of going with my programming.
Yeah.
But it's that part of the myth which says all things will come about in their time, just often not the way we expected them.
Mm-hmm.
It's that piece. But when we look at the notions of, take somebody who was this idealistic, who, if we look at Leto, his father in this universe, was, as far as feudalistic rulers go, because again, we have to remember this is neo-feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
As far as feudalistic leaders, though, go, he seemed to be relatively well revered and respected, and his people that for whom he was responsible for, he felt a real responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
We see that in part of the story where they go down to rescue the workers that before the spice mining machine gets swallowed. Right? He's like,
right.
Forget the machine, get the people here. That's part of that fundamental. He cared more about his people first,
Mm-hmm.
and then to see all of the things that Paul is then exposed to and exposed to and exposed to, because let's be honest, no hero, right? Even if we look at our, great farm boy hero from Star Wars, right? Let's go with Luke, Luke Skywalker. By the end of it, he's still a mass murderer.
Yeah.
If we look at how we regard our heroes, and sometimes the fact of, you have to do, I won't say the wrong thing, you have to take actions at times that have drastic consequences to accomplish the greater good. And one of the things that I think that we see a lot of is that notion of the weight of power. Ultimately, we see throughout time, the weight of power not necessarily corrupts. It doesn't have to corrupt, but it carries a great weight and a great burden that has a wear and tear on the person.
Okay.
And often that corruption comes when they're like, well, I did that little thing where I killed billions of people. What's one more?
Right.
And sometimes it's that one more that pushes somebody over that edge of, they're no longer the hero. They're now moving into that villain territory. And I think that if we look at the entire arc where Paul, going forward, spoilers, but Paul going forward gets that vision of the golden path and recognizes that humanity is on a path to extinction, and sees that and recognizes there's only one path by which humanity survives, and that's one step too far for him. If we look in book 2 where Paul is blinded, has his twin children, everything else, and fundamentally winds up going out into the desert. We have that notion of him recognizing that point of, I have to embrace the culture that I've embraced, right? The Fremen culture was that if you've grown blind, you don't want to be the burden on your people, but so that's you go out into the desert. Well,
Yeah.
but he's also still more than just blind. He's got a different form of sight. And
Yeah.
that's the thing by the end of the book and the end of the story is that notion of, I've done what I need to do. My children are protected. My legacy is there to pick up. The question is, and we know what the story tells us about what he believed he would see come out of his children. But he goes out into the desert. Then we see in the third book this notion of, his sister, the little Alia, the creepy ass kid, who really in many ways was the little psycho. But I mean, what from the film, the book, and everything else. But the notion of that family lineage, we don't really see in the film, doesn't explain it well, but the book does, that Baron Harkonnen was Lady Jessica's father, right? Or as Paul's father, right? So you've got
Right.
that lineage coming through, and that spirit then attaches to Alia, where the one left to bear the mantle of that power is also bearing the mantle of that power, but is also in many ways possessed by the Harkonnen. It's that legacy of the power passing through.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at kind of that familial burden, this is another thing that we see as a fundamental part of lore and power being passed on. And when we look at familial lines, I mean, look at something like Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
That's 100% about who's going to live long enough to get to the end.
Yeah.
But it's also very much about what are the experiences that lead you to try to go down the path of power. If you're making the decision, or if by birth the decision was made for you, you're going down a path of power. We see Paul being trained as a young child, how to fight, combat, diplomacy, education. We see things that, yes, they're advantages, but they're also requirements of the job.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're born into that, your perspective on it is going to be very different from, say, somebody who is someone who comes to power later, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of those things also, I think we've talked about this too, is sometimes achieving success is harder and more costly than failure, because if you're successful, then you've got to live with the burden of that success.
Yeah.
And if you've not been raised in that and born to that and have those skill sets, then it's much easier as well to steer someone who is not prepared for that along that path.
What do you feel like is harder to achieve in novel form, perspective or perception?
Ooh, I would actually probably argue perception on the way I'm interpreting it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can give perspective. That's part of being the storyteller is, now we've got to do it in ways that aren't just a ton of internal narrative, a la Dune. But I think that's part of what we get there is so much internal narrative
Yeah.
that you're seeing and hearing and feeling all of that internal dialogue. So it is literally the tell, not show in many ways, right?
And a
Especially
lot of it, but a lot of it is the unreliable narrators that go on in their heads too, especially when
correct.
it comes to Paul, because that's what they wanted. The Best Degenerate wanted to confuse
Right.
him, right?
Correct. And I mean, there's that degree of there's the unreliable narrator because the dialogue kept changing.
Yeah.
The story kept changing. The
Yeah.
influences kept changing. And this is one of those things that I think that Dune does well is you get to watch all of these subtle influences coming and batting him towards quote unquote destiny. If
Mm-hmm.
we go back to the first book and the first story, killing his father, all the efforts to kill them out in the desert, all of, learning the Fremen and the Fremen ways, learning and ultimately becoming a revolutionary and a messiah, right? We get that messianic figure down to the point of where he has learned all of these powers, but at the same time, he is no longer just a mere human being once he consumes the waters of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once he is the male that survives imbibing, the melange, right? The waters of life or the spice of life, however you want to go play with the language. But he is now transformed, so he is no longer just a mere human being.
Mm-hmm.
Where Fremen are raised with that, and it's just a part of them, and it's so they're also in that way somewhat trapped to the planet because they have to have that addicting chemical. This is
Mm-hmm.
one of those things I thought was really fascinating when you dig deeper into the lore is the spice itself, the effects it has on the people that take it, and the myriad of ways that gets reflected, right? It's not just, oh, you get pretty blue eyes or creepy blue eyes. It's not just that you get some prescience and the other things. It is, if you keep ODing on it long enough and survive, you get to become a navigator that looks like a giant space tadpole. You get to, which is not the way it was originally referenced, but David Lynch, he's going to take a little both. But again, this is one of those things I think it did well, was to show all of these influences batting him around towards that ultimate point of, the decision point. There are so many places in the story where a slightly different decision, and we wind up with an entirely different story to get down to that point of being the hero.
Mm-hmm.
What I think gets interesting, because we all, everybody I think knows heavily the first story, right? The first book, the first films. It's when you get into the second and third books that I think those are not as well known now as they would have been, say, 20, 30 years ago. But if you look at those stories now we get to see the weight of that power, right? Okay, you won it, you became the hero, da-da-da. Now we get to see the weight of the throne. We get to see the weight of this prescience and knowing that humanity is looking at this thing down the road. We get to look at all of the political intrigue. If I look at something like, to go pick on Star Wars and films 1, 2, and 3 that tried to create political intrigue, no, they just created procedurals.
Yeah.
Without creating the intrigue.
Yeah.
This creates the intrigue, and you get to understand enough about the procedures and how things are in play. And that, I think, was what was important, is you get to see what those factors, what the corrupting factors are. And the reason I'm a little hesitant to call them always corrupting factors is some things are just what they are, versus a corrupting factor we also see, which are intentions by which people are trying to erode that power.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have people that are intentionally going and trying to erode power, because they've got their own political aims, their own political agendas, when you're playing that game back and forth, often that's what ultimately leads to getting the villain you were trying to prevent in the first place.
Yeah. And it's not just with Paul, it's the whole family that goes through all of this, right? And
right.
And how each of them perceives the power and perceives what's going to happen and how they decide which direction they're going to go, especially Mother, especially in the second book for Mother. I think
Lady
Mother,
Jessica.
But it's just building layers like this, it's I mean, the things that Herbert was able to do, it's part of why I think after book 3 I lose a lot of what is going on. I think 3 really is, I mean, that's Paul's story, and I think I really gravitate to Paul's story more than anybody's. Right. But
well, so when you kind of leap forward into book 4, right, this is when this starts to become a little bit more esoteric.
Mm-hmm.
And that's saying a lot, right? The notion of, you've seen 3,500 years of history. You've become the God Emperor of Dune. You've gone through and you're the last of the sandworm. So you're the last source of the reason that interstellar flight can work.
Mm-hmm.
This is, so I mean, you're looking at take that away, and humanity goes back to being, you know, confined to their planetary fiefdoms.
Mm-hmm.
And but we get to go leap forward in that notion of, oh, well, we saw how he came about. Now we see what 3,500 years will do to somebody. If we think about the fact in book 2 and 3, let's just look across the first 3 books, and we
Mm-hmm.
go with Paul as hero. We're looking at what, 30 years, less
Yeah.
than 30 years of history,
Yeah.
and how much change happens to a galactic empire
Yeah.
versus 3,500 years with somebody going and saying, yeah, fundamentally I'm immortal, I can see what's coming, I'm going to set the path, and that path sucks, but if I don't take that path, all of humanity dies.
Mm-hmm.
It brings that question of, is there really only one path, or is this the only one that you can see? And that's a question that I think has been batted around kind of interestingly, because, and it's also one that I think could be changed, because again, one of the things that we see going back to book 2, Paul only saw the birth of his daughter. He didn't see the twins.
Yeah.
So it tells us the vision is never perfect.
Yeah.
And it's only going to tell you what it thinks you need to know, and what is that intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That still layers beyond everything else. There's still either it's imperfection, or there's still some grand global machine, or
Mm-hmm.
deification machine behind it all going, yeah, I'm still only going to tell you so much as I want you to know. Yeah.
For young authors out there, what do you think Dune would give them that maybe they wouldn't have in any other scenario?
I think that there is a lot to be learned, and I'm only going to go to the first 3 books,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that is if we look at that as a completed trilogy of storytelling,
Yeah.
it is an absolute subversion of the hero's arc. We get to see the hero's journey in book 1. Then we get to see the cost of power, right? We almost get to see how is a villain created. And the third one is that aftermath of, how do we define a hero versus the villain,
Yeah.
right? And so that level of storytelling, I think, is one thing, is to always look and question, what are the repercussions of your character's actions? One of the things that drives me nuts over time is, if you have, we see this a lot in fandom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fandom in fantasy folklore. You've
Mm-hmm.
got the great paladin hero who has slain hundreds and thousands of people, but yet his armor is still shiny, it is yet untainted, and he is still out to do the good.
Yeah.
I don't care who they are. You start to wear the weight of, if you're out there, even as a soldier, PTSD is going to kick in. There's a weight and a cost. And all too often, I think we have a tendency of not reflecting on the cost afterwards. But sometimes that's a matter of, where do we stop the story? And so if it's a single book, great. My hero won. They survived. They survived the great battle. Ta-da, we have the big party and we move on. But if you're writing a series where you're talking about, it's not only like, if you look at lit RPG, right? That notion of, oh, I'm leveling up. My powers are
Yeah.
stronger. My powers are stronger. My powers are stronger. My powers are stronger. Or if you're playing, let's say, an RPG, you're playing D&D or something like that. It's easy to go in and say, dun, 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 we're going to all just commit war crimes from one end of the campaign to the other. But if you're wanting to write something real and meaningful, is looking at a character who has to make the hard decisions and seeing how those weigh on them in time.
Mm.
And that to me, I think was one of the biggest, most important things is if we look at that story of Paul, he's the young hero. He's the one who's been forged in the fire. He's been trained. He has this moral fortitude. He has this birthright, and he has this whole destiny because of a bunch of desert witches, have had a breeding program going for him forever.
Yeah.
Da da da, you're the hero. You're the hero who has to do some pretty horrific things. We kind of
Yeah.
look at the notion of taking terrorist actions because that's what it takes to win, right? But
Yeah.
it's guerrilla actions. If we look at how they tell the story in book 2, you see the terrorists are now coming out to usurp and unset, but they're using the exact same approaches and guerrilla tactics and everything else that we saw Paul use in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of perspective. And going back to your question of what's harder, perception or perspective, perspective becomes that thing when you're telling, how am I looking at things? Perception is not only how do I look at it, but how's everybody else perceiving it and interpreting it. And that I think is the interesting part is how well do you get that feedback from those people around you going, do you know what the hell you're doing?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about the fact of what the repercussions are? You're going to go lead a ragtag band up against the hardest trained mercenary force in the entire universe versus, what are basically the sand people against,
Yeah.
commando troopers. But that notion of you're going to go lead, you're setting off atomics. And again, if we look at the time in which this was set, the notion of, we're just going to go set off some nukes, and then go running straight into battle. These are the kinds of things that, again, I think become really valuable, are to consider what does all this trauma do, even if the reader never gets to see those because the story doesn't progress.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's worthwhile to consider what does all of this cost have, because if you can contemplate that, especially if you've had to do a couple of the small things, which then get you into the, okay, I can do the next thing and the next thing. But some of that contemplation of, there was a time I would never have, I wouldn't have jaywalked. And now I don't think twice about slitting this guy's throat because he's in my way.
Yeah.
A little introspection there now and then is helpful.
Yeah. And it also depends on where you are as a person too, right? So, I mean, if you've deemed that there are certain crimes available to you that won't harm anybody else, then doing them doesn't seem as vicious as doing something to harm somebody else. But then when you start to skirt one rule, the other rules become just as blurry, right? So
over time, I mean, it's playing with that, and that to me is one of those things that, and I've been guilty of that before too, right? Is that notion of how much do you really want to show of that level of introspection and understanding of cost and understanding of repercussions for, I made this decision.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at magical systems, we spend a lot of time talking about, oh, there's the cost of this power, there's the cost of casting this spell, there's the cost of doing this. But we all too often, I think, we discount the cost to our characters. We look at how that helps them grow, but growth often comes from the hard thing. And that's one of those things that I think that there is, we see some of that here, but I don't think we see as much of it until we get to book 2 and 3, where that is much more of a, okay, you saw what it looks like to win. Now let's show you what the prize costs.
Yeah. For you as an author, as a writer, what does Dune do for you?
It's again, this is one of those series that I go back to, which to remind myself, okay, I suck as a writer. But uh um no, one of the things that it does help me do is look back at what are all of the influences that create a real world.
Mhm.
Part of the stuff that I joked about in my piece in fairy film, so some of the stuff I kind of poked fun at a little bit in folklore was what's the reality behind it.
Mm.
I pulled in, and some of this got cut, but out of the final version. But I actually talked some about Frank Herbert's growing up, going to a Jesuit school.
Mm.
The fact of dealing with priests, dealing with the nuns, the fact he didn't play so well and play so friendly. The fact that much of the influence of this was because he was doing ecological work out in, along dunes, right? Which is where it came from. What are all the influences that led him to some of these pieces? And looking, how do you take that small idea and turn it into something much larger? One of the things I wrote about in here, and because I've always joked about, is fundamentally sandworms are nothing more than desert dragons. But it's something that made sense in the ecology, or he found a way to make it make sense in the ecology. But he also talks about what are some of the biomechanics to make the sandworms do what you want them to. That notion of, oh, we plug this thing in and the sandworm's going to turn over. Well, why would that happen? Well, it's because, oh, it's an irritation. The worm's like, I don't want to be irritated, so I'm going to turn as far away as I can from the sand so I don't get irritated. Little details like that make things make more sense, make them feel real, are often the things that I see that make a big difference, and make a big difference to me between what's the fun story and what's something that makes me feel like I'm standing and could be plausible. What makes me feel like I'm actually standing on the desert and I'm looking for graboids and sandworms. Um, versus, okay, I blew through that story and I don't remember anything of it. What are things that are impactful versus the, okay, that was a fun time killer and it's now flushed and gone. Um, these are the kinds of things that I get more out of Dune. Or what are those little details that
Mm.
make something feel real?
You come from a long lineage of folklore too, and I'm curious if Dune helps you kind of navigate that a little bit too. I mean, or other literature, help you navigate through that to kind of get to what is, because a lot of it, there's probably a lot of telephone being played in a lot of these myths, often, right? So trying to get to the crux of what is real, quote unquote, to what is, just a bunch of gibberish.
Well, one of the things that I really find fascinating out of the Dune lore, right, is we look at the Butlerian Jihad, the notion of, oh, AI is taken over. And I mean, considering when this was written
Yeah.
and the notion of where technology stood at the time, I think that notion becomes very, very much a precious story to look at today. Is, oh, wait, what were the real implications of all of this with technology? And when we took the technology away, but we discovered things like the spice and whatnot to allow interstellar travel to continue to happen in some of all these other pieces. When we look at that notion of folklore, that to me is a really interesting version of telephone itself, is because let's just look at the universe. First of all, if you're going back, even look at, I mean, think about the game of telephone of how we perceive things from 10 years ago, much less 100 years ago. Think about going that far back, and the fact that now humanity has bred people to be human calculators and human computers. They've bred people for all of these different capabilities and superhuman powers, but they're very specific as to who they belong to.
Mm.
And So looking at that kind of a thing, the notion of, well, this is a whole big thing because technology took over and technology's evil. And then once that happened, we come back and now we look at the universe that we're in and the way that empires are built and politics are done. Now, in a way, that was a really fun technique to come and say, why would humanity develop in all of these different ways?
Mm-hmm.
It looked at the notions of, if we look at like influences here of Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, and genetics programs and breeding programs, and we look at even some of the influences we see coming back from eugenics programs and other things that were very much part of living memory at that point. We saw the notion of, well, which way can we go? Because using that to say there's a reason we can have interstellar travel, but we still think everybody needs to be using sharp, pointy sticks and swords and knives over things that, shoot big booms, gives that way of creating that fantasy, folkloric, Arthurian, medieval, feudalistic knights world, but gives you a reason for it to work that way. And looking at folklore and looking at how we interpret and take things over time, I think one of the other things that we can take from Dune is part of the purpose of good fantasy and good science fiction is to act as that. Everybody we often call them bellwethers and warnings and look at how things, but really I look at it more as hey, how are the different ways that this can play out? Because the stories we tell are often taking things to an extreme. Because the extremes, we then get to magnify and view some little point that's this big, but we make it a world. When from any one given point, you've got 360 by 360 degrees to go with any given idea and a whole lot of spaces in between. And the realities we get to create out of folklore, part of the fun out of this book, Fairy Films, part of the great joy out of playing with that was looking at all the story influences out of fairy myth and fairy folklore that have influenced the storytelling in the films we have now. If we look at some of the different stories in here and some of the different films that are explored, for me, I love myth. I love folklore because it tells us so much about who we are and how much we haven't changed. One of the funniest, so I was in Greece this summer in a museum, and one of the funniest things, I jerked the wife over. There were two things that were really funny as hell. Number one was this woman who was really, really focused on making sure she got a really close picture of Hercules' ass from, a 3,000-year-old carving, which was really entertaining. But the other part of it was I was kind of going through the exhibits and being a museum hound. The things that fascinate me often are not the big, the massive things. I mean, stuff that wants your attention. It's the little things. And there was a picture that had been taken from a Roman gladiatorial site, and it's in there on the. No, I guess it was a Greek Olympic site. We're in Rome and Greece. This is in Greece, so this is probably from the Greek Olympiads. And the original thing was a mosaic that said, basically like, George is sexy. And somebody had come along and scratched through George and said, Herbert. And I mean, this is something 3,000 years old, but yet we can see somebody came in and it, because it was still the athlete up there in the mosaic on the wall. And I mean, but that to me is one of the most human things. Is undoubtedly these two guys knew each other.
Yeah.
And it's looking at those little things like that are fascinating to me, because we want to go and sit here and say, create all the drama and look at all the noise and everything about everything going on at any point in time. And I think sometimes it's helpful to have the perspective that, guess what? This has happened before. It's going to happen again. And the Chinese, the old curse of may you live in interesting times. I
Mm,
don't know that there's ever been a time that wasn't interesting.
mm,
But I think one of the things for me personally is by going through and looking at history, looking at experience, looking at what has actually come before us, and often folklore and myth and legend and mythology and story tells us, guess what? Shit happens. Sometimes life is difficult, but more than likely you're going to make it through and you're going to grow. You're going to learn a lot from the experience. The experience may be wonderful or it may horribly suck, but at the end of the day, assuming you survive it, um, what you gain from that experience is up to you. Is did you learn from it?
yeah.
Because that I think is one of the things that I often see in stories is when the main character or a side character doesn't learn from their experience. And on one side, as a writer, that drives me nuts because what that does is that tells me that the character is not progressing and learning. On the other hand, that tells me, oh, that could be George. That's all too often the very human part of story is when we see the main character go through something, not learn from the experience.
Hmm.
And this has been one of those things as a writer that I think I've kind of adapted to over the last few years, right? Because it used to drive me nuts. If you're watching a movie, watching a TV show, reading a book, whatever it is, and you see a main character go through all sorts of stuff, and at the end of it, come out the other end, and they're still basically Forrest Gump. They've learned nothing from the experience. You want to sit there and go, "You're this.
What did I waste 2 hours
Why
on,
did I
right?
waste my time?" I mean, I never could stand Seinfeld, but this was part of one of the declared parts of Seinfeld
Hmm.
was to start a series where the characters go for the entire series. They're horrible people, and they're not designed to learn anything through the entirety of the arc of it.
If anything, it's the opposite.
If anything, it's the opposite. They just
They
get working more and more corrupted.
yeah, yeah.
Why do I want to waste my time on that? Why do I want that in my headspace? Because I mean, friends of mine that are huge fans of Seinfeld, and I've looked at them, and I think I've pissed many of them off at this point by looking and going, "So is this just to make you feel yourself feel better about your own villain origin story?" Um, but one of the odd things over time is that I've now seen that there's value in that story if the people that watch it and consume it learn from the fact that the characters didn't. And that is one of those things because again, the nature of human nature and why do we do what we do? Why do we believe what we believe? So much of what I do in life is all about how do you steer people to get them to do what needs to be done, right? If you're building systems, building processes, building technology, it's you're building something for a given purpose. How do I get people to do what needs to be done in the most optimal path so that they're not wanting to kill the technology?
Mhm.
I say this being somebody who's been doing this for a long time, and I can't wait for the day that I'm a Luddite and I put my phone onto a catapult and watch it be flung as far as possible from old school technology. But that to me is what is becoming more and more important is not necessarily do the characters learn, but what do we learn by reading and consuming and watching the material?
Mm, yeah.
Do we take away the lessons that we have an opportunity to get? And I'm not going to say the lessons that necessarily the author and the creator was intending, because frequently I don't necessarily know that they had that much forethought. Um, but this is one of those things that because every one of us has a different life experience, we've got different views on the world. We've consumed so many different things. We've watched it, we've read it, we've listened to it, we've experienced it, we've done these things. no two people are ever going to read or consume something exactly the same way. And this is that
Yeah.
co-creation experience.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things I think that we can get a great deal of out of with folklore as well, is remembering that every one of us have a unique human experience, but it's not that unique.
Nice.
Um,
I specifically did this way. I mean, obviously, Jim is Jim did a lot of really good stuff here to kind of give you all a grander sense of self, and speaking of, authorship and how to write and things of that nature. But these are conversations that Jim has on a I would say almost daily basis, but really much weekly basis over at Continual. And I wanted to give Continual some love tonight, and kind of show off a little bit what Continual does. So I appreciate you indulging me with that, sir. That's
oh no, uh, trust me, this was way deeper. And like, you said, hey, all you did was you pinged me and said, hey, you want to come talk Dune? Okay, sure. For
So
anybody thinking that this was prepared in any way, shape, or form,
yeah, no. All right. So this year, on this show, I'm asking my guests to. I have a questionnaire of 50 questions for authors, and so I'm asking my guests to give me 5 numbers between 1 and 50, and then I'll ask you the corresponding question of that number. So if you want, whenever you're ready, give me 5 numbers. Just reel them off, and I will get the question.
4, 11, 17, 42, and 31.
All right. I think we've had 4 before. Let me see what 4 is. Yeah, in fact, we just you and Josh asked the same number. Does writing excite you or exhaust you?
Mostly it's actually exciting to me. I mean, uh, there are, and I'd be lying if I said there were times that it wasn't exhausting, but for the most part for me, it depends on what it is. I mean, because I write a lot, but if I don't, I can tell you I don't run as and perform as well. And if I don't write, don't get to express myself, I don't process things as well. So if I'm not working on multiple projects at a given time, the insanity of the gerbils running around in my brain, chasing the librarians around, driving them crazy, they just go all over the damn place. At least if I'm writing and I'm working on things, it causes me to organize myself and my thoughts a lot better. And it doesn't necessarily what it is I'm working on, but if I'm not doing that on a fairly regular basis, then um, it's actually more exhausting not to.
Mhm. All right, number 11 is, in your personal opinion, what is the best way to market your books?
Well, the best way as an author to make $1 million is to start with 10 million in Facebook ads. Um, the, really, it's keep writing, keep putting stuff out the door, keep producing. I mean, because there is an extent to which, once you hit a certain number of books, you've
Uh-huh.
learned to write by the time you get a certain amount of stuff out the door, or at least you should have learned to write. And B, the more you've got, and the more you go out and try to publicize it and try to work it, the bigger your back catalog is, the more you've got to work from. I mean, but really, the best marketing you'll ever have is the next book you're working
Number 13, was there authors you disliked at first but you grew into?
on. Well, I would say I disliked Frank Herbert and Dune. I think I started with this, right? It was the first time
Mhm.
I read it. It was one of those things of there were certain aspects of experience I didn't have at the time to really understand and comprehend Dune for everything that was there at the age I was at. And because it was so different from so many of the other things I read, many of which were much more mature writing, um, but that was one of those things that I hit and I knew I had to go back to later. In terms of authors that I picked up their stuff and I read, and then I'm like, and then had to come back to later.
Hmm.
The answer is yeah, but you know, none that are majorly influential for me. Most of my favorite writers are people whose stuff that I picked up honestly at the right place at the right time and resonated in the right way. Now, there are a lot of books and things like that that I'll pick up and I'll go, not resonating with me right now. I'll come back to it later. That are some of my favorite books. You know, I like John Scalzi. I love John Scalzi, especially the Old Man's War series. All of those. I've read all of those. Um, I was going through Kaiju Preservation Society a while back. It
Hmm.
took me 4 or 5 starts to be in the right mood. Once I got it started, I blew through it because it's a fun little read, but it's not complex. Once you know how John writes and his story structure, oh, okay, I see the setup. Oh, okay, yeah, that's a still one of my favorite authors. Fun stuff to read, but honestly, the more and the better a writer and the more experienced he becomes, the less fun some of them are. But I love all of them. But again, it's one of those things of you figure out how somebody's mechanics work. Um, Versus there are some other writers that tend to, oh, I'm doing this. Here's my mechanics for this. Oh no, I'm doing this. Here's my mechanics for this. One of the things I'm doing right now is I am rereading, and some of them I've never read before, the entire Discworld series in the order they were published.
Jesus.
And the reason I'm doing this is I'm watching how his writing and storytelling style changed as they came through them. And I mean, so I'm sitting down and I can blow through one in a day or two. And, so, and then I'll go for a while and I'll pick them up. But I'm working my way through that because I'm watching how his style changed, Terry Pratchett's style changed over time. Because honestly, some of my favorite books are Terry Pratchett's, but they're all much later in the Discworld series. There's a lot of the ones I'm reading right now I never actually bothered to pick up and read. So right now I'm going through and I'm like, okay, not that complex. But I can watch as his style developed, as he learned a few more tricks. And it's an interesting academic process for me to go through that learning and how all of that works.
Number
I don't know if
40.
that answered your question or not, but I rambled.
I don't know either, but it sounded good. Number 42 uh, is what character of yours that you have killed would you want to bring back to life?
Uh,
And I realize this is a spoiler question, but oh well.
um, well, the problem is the one I would actually say that about, that book isn't out yet. So,
Mm, don't want to do
um, for the most part, so there's a couple of characters, but mostly in short stories that I've killed over time. And I'm like, oh, that'd have been fun to bring back, but you can only, bring back and play with. But there's not a whole lot I can look at and say, now there's some that I looked at and I said, this is going to, I felt bad about killing them. There's some that I'm like, I hate to do this, but the entire reason that some of them were brought into existence was to die. There's actually probably a couple more that I'm sad that I haven't killed yet, but their time is coming.
That would probably have been the better question. How many characters have pissed you off?
All of them. All of them.
And I swear to you, this is just random, but number 31 is a very interesting question for Mr. Jim Nettles, and that is, do you believe AI is here to stay and will affect the publishing industry more than it already has?
Yes and yes. I mean, so everybody is probably tired of hearing me ramble about AI at this point.
I
But
know. I was like, oh shit, I promised I wouldn't talk about it today, and there it was.
well, shit. Well, sometimes the universe conspires.
Yes.
Um, Here's the two things I'm going to say is that AI in the last 2.5, I mean, realistically, it seems like a lot longer than that, but ChatGPT was just really coming into the consciousness 2 years ago.
Mhm.
It's a little over 2 years ago. because I was in and working on some of the beta testing and some articles for it in version 2, which would have been in the summer 2.5 years ago. It may not even been out. But anyway, I was, working on some of that stuff, and I worked in different forms of AI and business intelligence and generative for a long time. So yeah, this is where we're at right now, is literally just the product of the last 10 years. We've been building up to what we have right now. And is it going to continue to? It's here. It's endemic. It is literally in every product. I can tell you right now, there's some stuff that we're working on that we're very intentionally not baking in AI, because that's part of our marketing to say there's no AI here. This is really about creating human connections and human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
No, people actually have to do this because I think that's part of it. But realistically, no, it's not going anywhere, and all it's going to do is continue to become more endemic. But I will tell you, in another couple of years, it's actually moving slower than I thought in certain ways. But
Mm-hmm.
um, again, the things that are having to catch up now are going to be intellectual property law. You sat through, us talking about that at Dragon this year.
Yeah.
What does this mean for IP law? Well, IP law, there's a ton of stuff flowing through the courts where they've got to figure that out. The second thing is going to be fundamentally, um, the technology is going to get better and better, so that what AI produces, and I'm speaking right now specifically about the publishing industry, written word, if you're in media, it's going to hammer you. I know, because I've already been through some of that. I've done enough stuff over time, still do, where if you're writing the generic garbage political article, I would dare say that the vast majority of the crap you've been reading for the entire political cycle, much of it was, if not written by AI, at least the early analysis and the early drafts were. You
Mm-hmm.
can, because you can watch the talking points, you can watch how it was prompted, you can watch how stuff came through. It's not going away. And AI art is going to continue to be a bigger and bigger, I won't say challenge, because it's just part of the technology now. But what I think you're going to see is exactly what we're starting to see now, which is that curve and that bubble's kind of burst. And now it's going and saying, what are we seeing in terms of generative technologies now? What does it really mean? What is it really able to do? And what is it not really able to do? I mean, I saw an ad yesterday with somebody coming out saying, "Oh yeah, for $29.95, I will tell you how you can write your book today, and you'll have a cover tonight,
Yeah.
and so you'll have generated a 40,000 word book, and you won't have had to have done anything." And guess what? Nobody's ever going to know. Nobody's ever going to care.
Yeah.
The more that the people that are putting out good work, putting out good product, and continue to do it, are going to be the ones who build a career. If you're building your career cranking out crap, especially system generated stuff, I don't care how much time you spend on prompts and everything else, at best you're going to get a mediocre, generic, basic outline, right?
Yep.
And one of the arguments I've been making, I think even going back to some of the original stuff, was, if you're trying to figure out how to do an outline, if you're trying to figure out how to tell the basic story, fundamentally what you're going to get out of any of these generative libraries is literally not a whole lot more than what you would get out of a Save the Cat beat sheet, except maybe it's going to give you some plot points to play with.
Yeah.
For everybody I know that is frustrated with and hates AI, there are reasons to be frustrated with it and hate it. But if you are thinking it's going to go away, which I see people on a daily basis, and I have people send me nasty notes, and all, I've had people blast me in a bunch of stuff talking about, why am I not trying to fight the revolution? If that's where you're coming from, you're spending all of your energy on a losing battle.
Mm.
Go produce. I mean, this is much like I had a round with somebody because of with some of the ebook stuff and piracy and everything else. And I knew a bunch of people that I won't say a bunch, a number of people over a period of time when they would go find, well, this was being pirated. I'm not putting out any more ebooks. Well, it killed their careers because, 95% of their sales were ebooks.
Yeah.
And their 5% of their sales that were in physical or paper dropped down to next to nothing.
Yeah.
There are certain things that are just part of the business. The business is going to grow. The business is going to change. And I mean, like a lot of my friends I know that work in film and TV and everywhere else, it's going to be the people that adapt and figure out how to use the tools in ethical ways. And those ethics are going to be shifting and changing pretty rapidly over the next couple of years. I still have huge issues over the way these systems have been trained.
Yeah.
That has been the big ethical issue I've raised all along, is how they've been trained and how they're continuing to be trained. And at the same, because again, when you look at Microsoft Word, if you look at all the Adobe products, all of these things are saying, by the way, you're going to check the box and say that we can use your stuff to continue to train the engines. I have a problem with that because there are times I work on things that are definitively IP. And guess what? I don't use a lot of these tools for those things that are definitively real IP. My fiction, it's going into a blender. Am I happy about it? No, I turn off a lot of that stuff. But at the end of the day, if it's going to go out the door and it's going to get published, it's going into the blender one way or the other. Am I happy about it? No, but it's a part of the game. But in some of the other things I do, which are truly unique IP and things that I'm working on, yeah, I do a lot more to protect it. It doesn't go into the cloud. It doesn't go into a lot of places, which means that I can't necessarily use all the tools that I might be able to the way I would like to. But guess what? There are always options that let you create if you want to protect it hard enough, if you want to spend the time. And one of the easiest ways to do that is, guess what? Have locally installed open source tools and things like that on a machine, or download and install them. And then that machine never connects to the internet again. Anything, any files that come to or go from or anything else, you sneaker net them. And for everybody that's sitting there pounding on their machine and screaming and yelling at me, because I've said this before and gotten nasty notes about I shouldn't have to do that. For every one of you who's been, doing all the stupid little stuff on Facebook and social media and all the other stuff that's been convenient over the years that you wanted to go play with, you've taught the machine, you've taught it how to work, you've taught it how to play. The biggest thing is going to be go do good work, be a good human being, and keep fighting the uphill battle. I mean, that's the life of the creator. That's the life the creator has always had. And it just is a different storm we're having to face these days.
Awesome. Well, on that note, we have a great creator here and a great guest. And thank you, Mr. Jim Nettles, for that. I appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you, sir, and have these wonderful conversations with you. And thank you for indulging me in doing it the way we did it tonight. And I appreciate that. And tell everybody where they can find you and all your stuff.
Well, the easiest thing to do is just go to jamespnettles.com. That'll take you to Author Essentials and the workshops. I'll be restarting those, and pretty much everything we're going to is mostly going to be live or virtual instead of the pre-recorded stuff, so that it's small live classes and everything else like that. If you want to come check out the stuff we're doing on Continual, easiest thing to do is come to Facebook and the Continual Convention Facebook group, or come to YouTube. You can get there through the site. You can check out my podcast and video cast, Creating Pros, which should hypothetically be coming back from hiatus. I've got some stuff sitting in the can. I've got to get edited and out the door. It's been on hiatus a little bit longer than I planned on, but hey, other projects took precedence. There's going to be some stuff some people might be really interested to know about with some of the tools and tech and stuff we're building right now, that will be rolling out some stuff for the creative space. Probably Q1 of next year is how things are looking, just to give a little bit of a teaser.
Nice.
I mean, Joe, you've gotten to see a little bit of it.
Yeah.
And for anybody that happens to be around in the Atlanta area, on December the 15th at Viking Alchemy Meadery in Atlanta, there's going to be a little author fest and creator fest. I'll be there. That's going to be my last in-person event for the year, as far as I know. Yeah, well, that wasn't a thing a couple of days ago anyway. So, and if anybody wants any books, you want them signed, just, message me. I'm always happy to ship books. I've got a couple left of fairy films. I'm gonna have to get the publisher to send me another batch. If you're wanting the business essentials books, workshop stuff like that, ping me, message me. I can get you class schedules. We'll be putting those up soon as I know what my schedule looks like in Q1. Because I already know what some of my travel schedule looks like. So now I'm trying to plan classes around those.
Awesome.
And other than that, I'll be back here in like 15 minutes because
I was just gonna say that. I was gonna say, everybody go and hang around Goindy now, because coming up about 15 minutes, Jim Nettles is going to join a group of explorers into the virtual world of Loch Ness in some respects.
Yes. I'm gonna go ride the monster.
as Mr. S.M. Hillen hosts Hit the Dice, which is coming up right after we close this in about 10-15 minutes. So I got to get Mr. Nettles over there. And so with that, I will say it's always time to go Indy now. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.